Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Java Invoice class video. So what we did in part number 1 is we covered the program specifications and then we walked through the invoice class. So what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to be walking through our invoice test class, which we've written to go ahead and test our invoice class. And then we'll go ahead and run the program. So let me click on my invoice test class next. And again, you do not want to do any of your testing within the invoice class. You want to create a separate class that does all of that testing for you in a separate file. The one thing you want to make sure and do is when you go ahead and create those classes, the invoice class and the invoice test class, that they are in the same directory. If you're creating them in Eclipse, they must be in the same package. So let's go ahead, click on the invoice test class. So the first thing we need to do, since we're gathering input from the users, we need to go ahead and import our scanner class. After we import the scanner class on line number 7, we create our scanner object. And then on 8 through 11, what we're doing is we're defining variables that we're going to store the information inputted by the user for each one of the instance variables. Line 14 is 15. Is where we actually go ahead and create our two invoice objects. So again, in order to create an object, you first need to specify the data type. In our case, it's an invoice type, the name of the variable that's going to hold that object, and then on the right side, the keyword new. And then what we do after that is we call the actual constructor. And our constructor was defined in our invoice class. So if we go ahead and look at that constructor, what it does is when that constructor gets called, it sets the part number to none, part description to none, quantity to 0, and price per item to 0.04 invoice 1. And then after it does that, it does the same thing. We create another instance, invoice 2, and it sets the various instance variables to those default values that we defined in our constructor. So what we're going to do next then is we're going to get the invoice 1 details from the user. So the first two items are strings, so we're using the next line method to retrieve those items, the part number and part description. We're using the next int method to retrieve the quantity and the next double to retrieve the price. And the one thing that I want to specify here, again, we're saving them into the variables that we defined up above. So what we're going to do next is, now that we've gathered the information, is we're going to be calling the invoice set methods to go ahead and set those values for invoice number 1. So again, in order to do that, we need to specify the object instance name, which is invoice 1, then a dot, and then the method that we're calling. So if we look back into our invoice class, we did define 4 different set methods, and what we're passing in is the part number, part description, quantity, and price per item. And then what we're doing with those values that get passed in is we're setting each one of our instance variables with those items that get passed in. So we call our set part 1, we pass in part num, which is where we stored the part number that the user inputted. The same thing for part descript, same thing for quantity, and same thing for price. So after we get through line 37, we've actually created our invoice 1 and we've populated it with the values that the user inputted. So what we need to do next is we need to get the invoice 2 details from the user. So we're going to be using the same variables. We're just going to be overwriting those variables with get the new information that the user inputs. And the one line that you'll see on line 42 is we need to go ahead and we need to specify that line, because on line 29, our last input value was a double. And the next double method only grabs the value itself. It does not grab the new line character when we hit enter. So what we need to do is we need to grab that new line character on line 42. And then after that, we can go ahead and get the information from the user. And after we run the test program, I'm just going to show you what happens if you do not have that line 42 in your program to gather the user input. So the next thing we need to do is we're gathering the part description, quantity, and price like we did above. We're saving it into the same variables using the same methods. And then what we're going to do then is we're going to call each one of the set methods for our invoice class for our invoice number 2 instance that we've created, and set those values, the part number, part description, quantity, and price per item. So after line 60, we have all the information that we need from the user. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and display the information. And the way we're going to display the information is we're going to use the get or accessor methods that we defined in our invoice. So if we scroll up to the top, we've defined 4 get methods, and what that allows us to do is get the value stored in each of our instance variables. So we're going to scroll on down. So we have our print line part number, and then we're going to specify our instance, then the dot operator, and then we're going to call the 4 get functions. And then on line 68, this is where we call our get invoice amount. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be formatting it with 2 places to the right of the decimal place with this format string. So if we look at our get invoice amount in our invoice.java class, what we're doing is we know the quantity and we know the price per item. So all we're doing is we're getting the quantity of and we're getting the price per item that are stored in those instance variables for invoice 1, and we're just multiplying them, and then what we're doing is we're returning that invoice amount. You do not need to create a separate instance variable in your invoice class to hold that invoice amount. Whenever you need that invoice amount, all you have to do is call the get invoice amount method, and it'll calculate it based on what values are stored in your quantity and what values are stored in your price per item. So that's what we're doing on line 68. So we've printed out the information for invoice 1. So on line 74 through 79, we're doing the same thing for invoice number 2. Again, we're specifying our invoice 2 instance, then our dot operator, and then we're calling the applicable get method. And again, when we display our invoice amount, we're formatting with 2 places to the right of the decimal place. So that's all our test program really does, is we prompt the user, we create the instances, we prompt the user for the information, we set the information, and then we get the information. So let me just go ahead and run the program. So the one thing you'll notice is when you compile your invoice program, so let me just go ahead and compile it. It compiles fine, but if I try to run this program or this class, it comes back and specified that there's no main method found in this class. And they are absolutely correct. There is no main method found in this class. The main method that we're going to be using to run is found in our invoice test class. So that is one of the reasons why when you create your invoice class and your invoice test class, that they must be in the same directory or folder on your operating system or in the same package if you're using Eclipse. So now I'll go ahead and compile my file, and I'll go ahead and run my main, and it prompts me for the information to input. So let me just go ahead and enter some information. First one is my part number, 117174. Part description, it is a fiberglass claw hammer. Quantity is 3. Price is 9.99. Okay, now it's prompting me for the second items. Part number 248774. Part description, polyethylene drip, irrigation tubing. Quantity is 2 and the price is 20.98. So if I hit enter, it prints out the information for my first item, part number, description, quantity, price, and then it multiplies it. And then as you can see, the invoice amount just has 2 places to the right of the decimal place. And then it does the same thing with my second part that I entered. It prints out the part number, description, quantity, price, and then prints out the invoice amount. So there's a couple of things I just want to show you that may help when you're troubleshooting and something's not working correctly. The first thing what I'm going to do is in my invoice test, I am going to comment out this line number 42. And I'm just going to comment that out to see the behavior that happens. So let me just go ahead and run this. So I'll just enter some garbage data here, 1.0. Now take a look at what happens when I hit the enter key. So basically what happened, it used the return and specified that as the part number, and it skipped to enter the description. So let me just go ahead and enter some information here, 1 and 1.1. So as you can see, our part number, it entered the return, which is just a null. So that's why it's displaying that. So that's why we need that scanner next line call to the next line method. So we have something that grabs that return when you enter the price up above. The second thing, let me just go ahead and save this. The second thing, what I'm going to do is I am going to actually delete my invoice class. So I will go ahead and delete that. And then I will go ahead out into my file system and I will just move my invoice class into my assignment directory. And now I'm going to go out and try to compile my tester class. So I'll go ahead and compile. And now what we're seeing is cannot find symbol invoice. So it's looking for that invoice.class file in the same folder as the invoice test.class file, and it's not finding it. So that's why we're running into those compile errors right now. So if I go back in and click on assignment, and let me see here, expand the directories a little bit, move that back into chapter 7, and go ahead, refresh. It's now in there, so I will go ahead and compile. So the nice thing about JGrasp is that if the invoice class is in the same directory as your invoice test class, it'll go ahead and compile that class for you when you compile the invoice test class, which it has done. We do not see the compile errors, and we should be able to run the program. So that's all I had for this video. So we will talk to you later.